Continuing You Can Change the World, The Christopher Approach by James Keller, with To Businessmen, a Challenge. The tremendous impact for good one businessman made on the lives of thousands was well illustrated recently in the farewell tribute paid him following his untimely death. In the June 28, 1948 issue of The Labor Leader are found these eloquent words: "The death of Basil Harris, president of the U.S. Lines, removes a Catholic landmark from the New York waterfront. He knew the shipping business and made it a profitable enterprise. For this, his associates honored him and sought his counsel. But the men who went down to the sea in his ships, the men and women working in his offices, the longshoremen and the union officials, all these respected and honored him for much better reasons. He was a man of his word, they said fair and square, a man who never belittled any man in his wealth or power. The inspiration of his life was Christ, and he served him well. All the titles and dignities that honored him meant little to him. Indeed, it was he who distinguished them. He would have rejoiced with a great-hearted laugh at the way the announcement of his death was received in a waterfront bar. The tussler pushed his cap back, drenched the news with his beer, and said something that was very unchristian, you could say. God, that was a good guy. The gang's yep would have sounded better to Basil Harris than any choir's amen, because you're not supposed to use God's name in a secular context. That's really the, that commandment, right? Technically the third, right? Well, the third in that list. I didn't know. The 1,500 persons who attended Mr. Harris's funeral at Rye, New York on June 21st, 1948, included very many business leaders, to be sure, but a far greater number of stevedores, dockmen, teachers, caddies, grocers, taxi drivers, gardeners, policemen, office help, and others came to bear witness to their love and affection for one who had at all times given those very things to each of them. In many ways, Mr. Harris was a Christopher. Love of all people, the distinguishing mark of the true Christ-bearer, was certainly a part of him. Many know of the generosity he displayed in sharing his material possessions, but only a few are aware of his countless daily acts of kindness to those who needed and wanted more than money. He was motivated from within by some greater power than mere human philanthropy, an activity all too seldom accompanied by personal solicitude. The most significant tribute, perhaps, that could be paid him was the quiet service he rendered during the Depression of the 30s. Countless unemployed men and women who sought desperately for jobs found, when they approached Harris, the helping hand they needed. I don't know of anyone who has gone to him in search of a job that hasn't been helped getting one by him. An associate of his commented at the time, "I take off my hat to him. Most give money, but Basil does that and more. He gives his time, he gives himself." The driving force back of all this was a deep spiritual sense which had been stimulated while Harris was a student at Princeton University. One evening, near the end of the school term, he visited 3 classmates who roomed together in order to go over some examination material with them. After a couple hours of study, one of them decided to go to bed earlier than the others. He said goodnight, and then went off into this corner of the room. Once into his pajamas, he knelt down and for about 10 minutes recited the rosary. This simple expression of faith made a lasting impression on Harris, and during his lifetime he referred back to it continually. As for the student, little did he realize that what he had done was to be the turning point in the life of one of his companions. Years later, Basil Harris became a Catholic, and from then on his entire outlook was dominated by a devotion to God that was strong, resourceful, deep, and constant. Unlike many other successful businessmen, whose very expressions betray preoccupation with power and wealth, Harris displayed a wonderful sense of humor and gaiety. He took pleasure in giving others pleasure. He was particularly kind and cheering to the poor, who often get the least personal attention. Wealth as such meant little to him, and his feeling in this regard was well expressed in a remark he made one day while en route from Washington to New York. Reading in the paper about a millionaire who had just died, as he was in the process of building a large new estate, he exclaimed, "This sounds like the fellow in the gospel, the one who pulled down his barns to build bigger ones and forgot he was to appear before God that very night for the final payoff." That's the sort of thing. If you leave a comment which verse that's referred to, that'd be nice. At the other end of the economic ladder, a small businessman, a tinsmith in New York, saw his goal in life with the same clear vision as did Basil Harris. The purpose of this tinsmith, one Paul Antonio, was to make the world a little better than he had found it, because he tried to think and act in terms beyond the confines of his own small shop. One thing in particular that he did bears mentioning now. Some time back he was hired to build and install the Black Sea ballot box, which is now used by members of the Security Council of the United Nations at Lake Success when they cast their votes on world issues. When the box was opened just before the first Security Council session, there at the bottom was a brief message written in a clear handwriting on a cheap piece of notepaper. The message read, "May I, who have had the privilege of constructing this ballot box, cast the first vote. May God be with every member of the United Nations organization, and through your noble efforts, bring lasting peace to us all over the world." Signed, Paul Antonio, the mechanic. By this one simple act did Antonio give the council members a reminder of the importance of the supernatural. At the same time, because the incident was widely publicized for its human interest angle, he got the same lesson over to millions in our land and over the world: a proper approach. There are many businessmen who feel and act as did Paul Antonio and Basil Harris, but there are many, many more, and this constitutes the majority, on whom a God-given concept of a human existence has not made a sufficient impression. These men are good, solid citizens, however. They stand for law and order, they are a credit to the community, but unfortunately, they often underestimate the power for good, which they could exert on a large scale. They restrict themselves in so many ways to spheres that are local and small. They do not participate actively and in great numbers to influence for the better, as sure as they could, the trends that convulse mankind today. There is this lack of recognition of the truths that make men free. They may acknowledge that the world is sick, yet too often they neglect to do what is ordinarily common sense to cure its ills, and by their neglect they leave the field to those who have a well-calculated, carefully prepared plan to revolutionize the earth and reshape it in the form of a totalitarian, godless global state. A French businessman who visited this country not long ago made a statement which illustrates the situation in all its stark reality. "My interests were limited to my business, my house, my weekends." This Frenchman said, "I paid no attention to our government, our schools, our labor movements. I found out rather late that those who were very much interested in every phase of France's public life were men whose one evil objective was to wreck our country. That they have nearly succeeded is due to the neglect of men like myself to give time and intelligent effort to what concerns the common interests of all. It was my mistake as a businessman. I hope American businessmen do not make the same mistake. American businessmen have been making that mistake, unfortunately. Their handicap has been that too often they have identified themselves with things rather than ideas. They do everything possible for the comfort and convenience of the body, forgetting that the totalitarians hit first, last, and always for the intellect and soul of each and every man, woman, and child. The godless know that whoever controls the thoughts of man controls all else. They know that they can regiment whole peoples, depriving them of their God-given liberties. In Russia, where an organized minority of the godless hold complete sway, they have done exactly that. Robert Ripley, in his feature Believe It or Not, points out that a Soviet citizen may not own land, may not choose his own job, may not strike, may not employ labor, may not own jewelry, may not be tried by a jury, may not absent himself from work, may not picket, may not travel, may not ring a church bell, may not be friends with a foreigner, and is forbidden. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of soul. Well, I think the ancient Egyptians, their word back, the soul servants, different than the abd. The abd is the bodily. And so the back, well, I mean, an abd is a servant, but it's in a bodily sense. The back is the, because you can't, it goes beyond even the mental. Your spirit is in service to whatever. For a businessman reading this to reply with the somewhat hackneyed, "It can't happen here," is to ignore facts without even realizing he is doing so. By the very nature of his calling, a businessman should be a force for good, and in far beyond his community. Yet, for all the groups of people, as one business firm itself pointed out, businessmen are most laggard in their interest in the exchange of ideas. People feel this lack of interest. You have only to recall what happened at the political rallies of the Wallace Party in Philadelphia last July. Not all of the convention delegates were totalitarian-minded. Many who were confused individuals who were not being reached by anybody. Still, to quote Joseph and Stuart Alsop in the New York Herald Tribune, the great majority of the people here are being used carefully and astutely by the communists. There lies the great peril to this country, the failure to show concern for those of our population who need concern the most. Annie O'Hare McCormick, writing in the New York Times, was even more specific in this regard. The danger in all this does not arise from the power of Mr. Wallace. Miss McCormick stated, it rises from the babes in the wood that constitute a large part of his followers. If this convention represents a cross-section of the United States, the woods are full of peace seekers, panacea seekers, instinctive isolationists, thwarted people of goodwill who are ready to listen to demagogues. Good deeds wasted. Often a businessman will give a new wing to a college or university, and yet have little or no idea what will be taught in the building he donated. Not infrequently, the very principles for which he stands will be undermined in the classrooms he built. Again, with but few exceptions, the large foundations created by prominent businessmen are confined to the physical and material, seldom to the development and furtherance of the basic principles on which our country as a free democracy exists, while America is a republic, SPQR. And in some ways, you could say a republic's better, but, I prefer constitutional democracy myself. For example, only recently it was discovered that a communist had gained an important post on a large foundation established by a well-known industrialist, and this subversive took every advantage of its position to sabotage with the few well-chosen, dishonest ideas the noble purpose for which the foundation was built. From one end of this country to the other, tens of thousands of our finest citizens are engaged in various forms of small business. These people constitute part of the backbone of our nation, but their primary preoccupation is with the small problems in their midst. Meanwhile, they are being saturated with poisonous ideas by other men who, daringly bold, are gambling for big stakes and are playing for keeps. These doers of evil are not outsiders. They are part of our American society. With amazing prophetic accuracy in the 19th century, the great British historian and statesman Lord Macaulay pointed out that your republic, he says, will be pillaged and ravaged in the 20th century, just as the Roman Empire was by the barbarians of the 5th century. With this difference, the devastators of the Roman Empire came from abroad, while your barbarians will be the people of your own country and products of your own institutions. Amen. That's happening. It's not a good thing, but we see that it's happening. Concept of God ignored. Most thinking people are aware that some sort of a breakdown along these lines is going on in America. When they don't seem to realize, however, it is probably the greatest single factor in the rise of the godless philosophy of totalitarianism comes from allowing the concept of God to fall into disuse. Some businessmen have lost all sense of the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God. They have lost the realization that every human being is a child of God. Remember that metaphor in the Bible of how you can choose to be a child of God or choose to be a child of Satan. Made in his own image and likeness, one British colonial industrialist not long ago expressed the tragedy of this attitude when he said, "There was a time when I might have been interested in helping poor devils in need. Once I even thought of building a hospital out here for the study of tropical diseases, but I kept putting it off until I had more time and money. When I began in this hole, I was going to quit as soon as I had 10,000 pounds. When I got that, I decided to make it 20. Then I went on piling up money until it was too late. The stuff has buried me." This man had lost contact with humankind in the tired, slow shake of his head. As he spoke, it was obvious that he was alone and fated forever to remain so unless he made a sincere effort to regain a sense of perspective, to regain the true belief that fame and fortune in this life are fleeting and the things of heaven are not. The situation is not hopeless. This man's case and thousands like his are not hopeless, however. There is still time, though the hour is growing late, to get back on God's side. But men of goodwill must be more than just against personal evils and present public ones, such as communism or Nazism. Remember, that's a racial slur that occurred before the NSDAP, or fascism. All these evils spring out of the warped attempts to correct abuses and right wrongs. Corporatism is among that, which they're not mentioning here for reasons, I'm sure. But it's not under that guise per se. It's just, the per se after the goods of the world, you could say. Not righting wrongs or anything, just a way for some people to make more money. And even if all these philosophies were suddenly eliminated, the principal problem would still remain that of the godless materialism, which is the cancer in the life of America. Just as disease strikes not because of the power of the germ, but because of the lowered resistance of the body, so a great many otherwise good people with scarcely a speaking acquaintance with the first principles are becoming easy targets for many popular errors. Sound-thinking, God-fearing people must be for something. They must be for the daily application of all the God-given principles upon which this country is founded. Businessmen could be the shock troops of these good ideas. Once they see that it is from these ideas alone that the great forces in this world, good as well as evil, proceed, if they will apply the same ingenuity and devotion to the spread of good, sound American ideas that they apply to their own private pursuits, they can arrest and change for the better more effectively perhaps than any other group the disintegrating process that is menacing more and more the best interests of our country and our civilization. Businessmen striving personally and individually, however, can easily bring about a change for the better if they will devote a comparatively small part of their time and effort, and perhaps no more than 1/10 of the money now being expended on their present charities, to preserve and spread the fundamental American principles which make their business, their private pursuits, the very life of their nation possible. To their credit, more and more business professional men are beginning to realize their responsibilities and, more significantly, are beginning to do something about it. One zealous Christopher, an Indiana lawyer, drew up with a group of friends an advertisement and arranged for it to be given eye-catching space in several daily newspapers in the Midwest. The cost in one case was borne by a chamber of commerce and another by an insurance company. One daily, the Cleveland Press, even ran an editorial on it. Though it appeared only once, it brought home to countless readers a positive fact, of which many of them are losing sight of, and which they need to be reminded. The advertisement read, "Do you believe in Americanism? Then hold these truths. 170 years ago today, our founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence expressed the basic principles of Americanism in these words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." How the pursuit of happiness is not really something that people can give or take per se, because your happiness, what do you find your happiness in? It could be in wronging others, could be in wronging yourself or whatever. And, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Thus, as a good American, you must believe that 1, God is the creator of all men. 2, your rights and the rights of your fellow men are God-given, and for this reason alone, no power on earth can take these rights away. 3, as a personal creature of God, each of us is equal on the side of God to every other person, and for that reason each of us is entitled to the equal protection of all the laws of the land. 4, government is not man's master. On the contrary, government is man's servant, chosen by man to protect the God-given rights of mankind. Upon the firm foundation of these truths, the glory and prosperity of our beloved country has risen steadily through the years to be the crowning wonder of the world. These truths have made America great. Only these truths can keep America great. If you want to be a good American and preserve the blessing of liberty for yourself and your posterity, then hold these truths. Now, okay, one of the things that we can look at there that make America great again, this is what it's talking about. And it's talking about, what the Civil Rights Act brought about, equality and stuff like this, and perfecting it and stuff. But that's really what the whole thing is about. People are like, oh, remember, there's some bad things happened in the 50s, and it not till the end of the 60s, not till, but then at the end of the 60s, certain racist policies got instituted as a counterpoint, and that wasn't the problem. So, that wasn't the problem fixed. But getting rid of that sort of equity thing and, affirming equality was, that's what's being talked about. Now, some stuff could be associated with that, certain politicians and stuff like that I'm not agreeing with. I'm not saying that, but emulating the examples of the Indiana lawyer and his associates, a group of businessmen and newspaper officials in the Midwest have embarked upon a campaign to get service clubs and parent-teacher organizations in states not requiring the study of the Declaration of Independence to correct this condition at once. Further, several of these same men have set up a program urging that the head of the household read the Declaration and the preamble to the Constitution to the entire family on the 4th of July. And so one of the things about that is, the country you live in, you should put yourself in a position where you're working for it, you could say. You don't have to agree with its wrongs to do that. It's just, in similar vein, just a few months ago, the Beveridge Paper Company of Indianapolis announced its determination to work for a wider recognition of the basic American doctrine, which is the heritage of free men and a free society. We hear a great deal these days about various plans, the 5-year plan, the Marshall Plan, and many others. This company wrote, "We think it is well for us to give heed to another plan adopted July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence. We have had copies of this prepared and are enclosing one herewith. In addition to these methods of bringing to the public consciousness our priceless God-given heritage, many businessmen have also found other means of getting into the mainstream of life with the sound ideas whose widespread distribution will do much to preserve our free way of life. In some cases, they have done this personally. In other cases, where they have been unable to get into the thick of things themselves, they have encouraged and actively assisted others to go into the marketplace. Some of the enterprising businessmen hold prominent positions in industrial and financial life. Others are less in the public spotlight. A stockbroker in Upper New York State has encouraged his 2 daughters to become teachers and his son to go into government service with a Christopher approach. A 46-year-old Cincinnati businessman gave up a $30,000 a year manufacturing position to prepare to join a college faculty where he can teach American government. He claims, as the motivating reason for this step, the deep impression made upon him by many young people who want to participate in politics but don't know what to do. And he continued, "When I decided to go back to school after being away for 26 years, I was afraid my friends and business colleagues would think I was crazy or something. I was astonished to discover that 90% of them, many whom I thought were only interested in making an honest buck, considered it a wonderful idea and wish they could do the same. A businessman in Boston is currently helping his son in all the necessary preparation required prior to his entering the labor relations field. A public accountant who assisted his son to follow a career as a film scenario writer has seen his interest pay dividends 1,000 times over in several outstanding motion pictures this young man has already helped prepare. An insurance man in a firm which employs some 1,000 persons is acting as a committee of one to step up interest in the workers about getting better quality Americans into the 4 spheres which mainly influence our lives today: education, government, labor management, and communications. A lawyer who found himself, in his own words, getting so wrapped up in law practice, I've been overlooking the more important things of life, has completed plans to go into government service with the Christopher motive in mind. An official in a large New York publishing concern goes on record with the following: "Last year I was asked to consider running for the school board but I decided against it. Later, when I was mentioned my refusal to a Christopher friend of mine, he told me it was my duty to run. So this year, when a similar request was made of me, recalling his advice, I did run and was elected. Now that I'm on the board, I can tell you, I never realized that there could be so many wonderful opportunities to further fundamental American principles. My only regret is that I didn't realize it sooner. As soon as there are more people like these turning on lights in our country, then there are enemies turning them off. Then and then only will the darkness begin to vanish. Same methods, a different goal. In a specific way, businessmen can learn from the godless how they carry their ideas into every field in which they can reach the most people, how they put thousands of their missioners into all fields that sway men's thoughts and actions, and as businessmen pattern their procedure after the godless, but with a different goal and a different motive, as they inspire tens of thousands of Americans to dedicate themselves to the task of bringing into every phase of public and private life the idea that there is a personal God, that man is more than an animal, and that all the rights he has have their origin in and depend upon the Almighty. They will restore a sense of personal responsibility and individual accountability as an integral part of American life. The sobering effects of such a task are well emphasized in a passage from a recent motion picture where a father speaking to his son said, "In a sense, we are all servants placed here on earth to serve. Some of us, by the will and omniscience of the divinity, have been given a greater task than others. I count myself somewhat to my sorrow as a member of that group. It is a very grave thought to me to think that I may soon have to render an account of my stewardship to my Maker. I have held control of some large industries in this country, and through them I have controlled the lives of many people. This is a solemn thought, and some day it will be a solemn thought for you. There are certain definite obligations for one in my position and one in yours, and one of them is to try and make your life worthwhile with the advantages God has given you. Such realization, belated as this man's was, is a wonderful thing. But similar realization in all spheres of our national life must come, and come quickly, if we are to avoid disaster. Make no mistake about it, the 20th century has brought into being, for the first time in all history, a vigorous, aggressive, ruthless crusade to spread evil from one end of the earth to the other. It is global in scope, and it is here to stay. It is spreading with astonishing speed. It is ever on the march. By its deceptive and destructive allurements, it has already blighted, poisoned, and enslaved hundreds of millions of people. Businessmen can do much to change this trend, and it will be a glorious thing if the businessmen of America who accomplished so much to win the recent war will go one step further and help win the peace for which the world still longs. Julius Ox Adler, Vice President and General Manager of the New York Times, speaking recently on the subject, Preparedness by a Free People, for the 17th Annual 4-Day Conference of the Chaplains Association of the Army and Navy of the United States at the Hotel New Yorker. He noted that same idea. "None of our freedom is absolute," he said, "nor could it be, and long survive. Freedom of the press does not include the right to print. The libelous are obscene." Well, who defines obscene? "Of all our freedoms are restricted at the point where their abuse might imperil the rights, comfort, or safety of the community as a whole. Why, then, should we absolve from restrictions a group, the Communist Party, whose loyalty is not to this nation or its flag, whose demonstrated creed is the extinction of freedom wherever they get power?" That's one of the dangers that we constantly face, right? We have these people. Now you have to swear allegiance not to the country in certain government positions, but to certain party agendas. Or if you're caught supporting right-wing values like freedom and criticizing abuses of the elite or something like this, well, I mean, can't you just can't they just allow you to be supportive of America, trying to do what's good for America, regardless of your political party and all that stuff? Mr. Adler then went on to describe the communist creed as lacking in the spirit of give and take, and as narrow and intolerant. Infiltration, conspiracy, sabotage, organized turmoil, and agitation. We see that in the streets. He added, all maxed under 100 innocent-sounding names behind 1,000 unsuspected fronts. Like nowadays, if you can say you're anti-something, and you can be more that than, than other groups, right? Even the ones that you really can't be naming, like they're using the NSDAP, for example. It's like, we're going to be supportive of the USSR and all the oppression and killing they did. Wait, what? So you're against fascist? No, you're even more fascist. James Keller, is it James Keller? Yeah, James Keller certainly got that part right. Same things, lives matter, and yet you kill more of them than the KKK. Yeah, we see through you. The origin, orientation, and direction of communist policy is not American. Its membership is not public. There's corporatism. Well, corporatism has public thing, but yeah. Communism does not believe in the basic freedoms, nor does it grant them, where it is in power. However, to accomplish its destructive purposes, it vehemently insists on those freedoms whenever they are available. Urging preparedness on a wide front, Mr. Adler concluded, we can drift toward war if we are apathetic, disinterested, careless, or ill-informed. Carrying that last thought still further, peace will come only when the basic idea on which our country was founded, that man gets his rights not from the state but from God, becomes a world reality. The problem of bringing this about is largely one of distributing or merchandising the basic idea, since by the very nature of their work, businessmen must be specialists in distribution and experts in merchandising. They should inevitably succeed in seeing this fundamental idea is given wide circulation and thorough integration into every phase of American life. It should be an easy matter for them to outdistance the forces that are now working feverishly to infiltrate and to spread their stupidly false idea that man is nothing but a creature of the state. Well, humanity has its different roles, but how many of these roles are, the only thing? I don't think really any of them are the only thing. But considerable experimentation has proved this can be done with relative ease. All over the country, thousands of Christ-bearers have been encouraged to go into the 4 important phases of public life and have been encouraged to show the same determination in restoring basic Christian ideas as others are displaying in throwing them out. The success of these businessmen, Christophers, in every field is living proof of what can be done. Now, in that case, if you're a Christ-bearer or if you're a light bringer or whatever, you, in a wider sense, you can include all those aspects of life as part of that. All that remains is to increase the number of distributors of good ideas. Businessmen can certainly be effective Christophers themselves, and by the same token, they can and must get others, many others, to be Christ-bearers. There is no time to lose. Things are moving fast. It is either to lead or be led, influence or be influenced. To survive individually, one must survive persistently in helping all to survive. Now as never before, it is one for all and all for one. As businessmen rise to this glorious challenge of spreading ideas as we know they can, the prospects for peace will begin to glow even brighter. But nothing must be taken for granted. Success will be directed proportionate to their thinking in terms of all people, not merely a few.